Welcome to the show, Matthew Arrett, the one and only legendary Matthew Arrett. How are you doing, man?
I'm doing great. Always a pleasure to be with you.
We haven't been talking for a while. Dude, I've been following you for quite some time and reading some of your articles, even joining your new Telegram group. It's amazing stuff you post. I mean, not only from yourself, but what I find really, you have a very holistic approach to things, to to the reality we are surrounded with. And what I also love, your articles, whether you write it yourself or your wife or your, the cooperation partners, like the one piece that you published today. It wasn't by you, but it was, what is it called? On CanadianPatriot.org. So by the way, Matthew Arrett is one of the most leading investigative journalists, author, historians, if I may call you. And the article, what I really loved is China's high-speed trains, North America, where are you? Pretty good piece. It was written by Larry Romanoff. Yeah.
Yes.
So this is why I mentioned that, because I want to talk to you about the broader understanding implications of what kind of technologies have been suppressed, what is possible, what's the solution, what are the answers, because I mean, you have such an in-depth knowledge and comprehension. You can connect the dots, you can give people, even the layman on the street, the woman and man on the street, the bigger picture. But let's just start off, because it's so critical right now. This whole, because I feel like we're on the verge of on the peak of a clown theater when it comes to this whole Russia, China, U.S., Anglo-American complex, NATO complexity going on. Can you give like a maybe pretty short, like overview, comprehensive, like overview, what's going on? I heard that even Russia has been like taking control over 20% of the I don't know what to call them, their territories. Can you just maybe expand a little bit?
Well, you have a dying system on the one side, which is a system that up until a few years ago was relatively unchallenged. It was sort of the only game in town, and this game was created as a rigged game. That no one participating by the rules that we were told to play by could have possibly have won. It's like going into the casino and expecting to beat the house. It really doesn't happen that way. It's not wired to work that way. And the little gains you think you might be getting are actually undoing you in the future. And that was what globalization was wired to be. The operating system was established really in a full-throated way with Henry Kissinger's work alongside George Shultz, his colleague in the Nixon administration, who together worked very closely with a network that came to be the basis of what was known as the Trilateral Commission, that fully came in with David Rockefeller, Zbigniew Brzezinski, under Ford and Carter, especially Carter. And what was done was the US dollar, which was the basis of global exchange rates. Anybody wanting to settle any type of balance of payments or any type of, international financial activity had to have reserves of US dollars. And that had been the way that it had been since 1945. The US dollar was removed from the gold reserve system. And with that, a new logic was brought in. This is the rigged game I was telling you about. That new logic was, we no longer have to have an industrial economy anymore. Capitalism is now going to become post-industrial. That was a fraud. That right there, if you had an inkling of morality available in a position in people who had positions of leadership, they would have immediately have corrected that lie right away, because you cannot have capitalism if you're post-industrial, if you're not productive. It just means that where you get value from, where you extract value, and what associates value with the dollars in circulation in your system is going to be tied to either, well, what are unproductive ways of making value? You could speculate, you could gamble, which is what increasingly happened as, the dollar was floated onto the floating exchange rates, which made it not tied to any type of measurable variable on industrial indices. So the US dollar, or any dollar, increasingly with that became tied to whatever people want to bid on the futures or spot markets on what they think oil is going to be, because now the petrodollar is going to be created in 1973. So increasingly, it's just whatever the animal spirits of the markets demand is what the value becomes. Well, what if the animal spirits are insane, right? What if people lose a sense that, they should have running water? They forget that, and they don't value. What if they just value heroin over reliable sewage systems and running water? Well, the animal spirits go nuts, right? And that's what increasingly happened as the system was deregulated. And with that deregulation, you saw a stripping of national power. Nation states were no longer in a position to play any role in economic activity. And increasingly, who did play the role was supranational financiers, private central banking institutions, private corporations, which got bigger and bigger, right? As they were unbounded and they were allowed to have mergers and acquisitions that they would normally have never gotten away with in previous decades. Everything became part of the profit is good, 1980s me generation period, where this really got consolidated. And during that time, the backbone of Western capitalism, the small and medium enterprises, the mom and pop shops, the agro-industrial, smaller and medium, businesses, which is where all of the innovation was happening, all of the new discoveries, the new ideas were primarily being driven by the lifeblood of the Western economy. This was all being crushed. They were people who were not multinational corporations couldn't pay the 20% interest rates that Paul Volcker Trilateral Commission jacked up as part of his controlled disintegration of the world economy from 1979 to 82. They couldn't pay that. Foreign countries got more indebted, right? During that period, that same period, it wasn't just local businesses and farmers that were wiped out, but also look at the rate of debt slavery over Africa, South America, Asia. All of these countries all of a sudden had to, pay 20% on their debt obligations. They couldn't do that. That sunk them ever more deeply. So you had a game where everybody who played was going to lose. And one other component of this involved a master-slave society. It wasn't called slavery anymore. It was wrapped under a new set of words. But the logic was the same. It was economic in slavery, but, we were told, oh, aren't you at least happy if somebody was bothered by this sweatshop, cheap labor markets of Indonesian children working 14 hours a day, to make cheap baseballs for Walmarts? People who might have had a problem were told, oh, but isn't it better that they earn 25 cents a day working 14 hours than getting nothing? Would you rather that they get nothing? Aren't you heartless? And these types of stupid, lame arguments somehow were accepted. And we just got more addicted to cheap labor. And for the labor to stay cheap, the people had to stay undeveloped, right? And because as soon as you develop a people, if let's say Indonesia or China or Mexico, which we're utilizing for their cheap labor in the 1980s and 90s, what if they start developing their infrastructure? What if they start developing mass education? These kids will all of a sudden spend a lot more time in school, right? The more advanced the society is, the more time you can have, or expect you should have, to expand your mind in higher education, right? So all of a sudden you'd only enter the labor force when you're maybe 24, 25, 26. That's a lot of lost cheap labor. And when you enter the labor force, you're going to have a longer life expectancy, right? A longer quality of life, higher technological skills. That means your labor is going to be more expensive. It means you cannot still make those cheap dollar store baseballs. It means that you're going to have higher paid labor. And that's been the case going back to the American Revolution. There was a fight over whether America was going to be a cheap labor market, producing cash crops and cotton for the British textile manufacturers, remaining relatively underdeveloped, which is what it was after the revolution, and also in debt, unpayable debts, or whether it was going to have protectionism, an industrial developed workforce that had a longer life expectancy, more powers of productivity, more cognitive power. That was a fight. And That's the fight that happened over the course of the past 50 years again. But now, instead of it being the US has been, keep in mind, during this time, JFK has died, Bobby Kennedy has died, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, earlier Franklin Roosevelt dies, probably assassinated, as do many of his better anti-imperial allies. There have been many American presidents who were killed, resulting in a situation where the US became taken over, kind of like, Star Trek, right? You have the Borg, which take over hosts. That's sort of what happened with the US as a body being infiltrated by this this deep state, which increasingly took control over the dead bodies of these patriots and had it serve the interest not of the US or the people, because the people were destroyed. The US government became less secure, right? The world became more unstable. So nobody really benefited as far as people or the nation. Who benefited from this whole 50-year, 60-year process of the rigged game were those same agencies that have always wanted to restore a new feudalism, to undo not just the American Revolution and not just destroy the USA, but to undo the Renaissance that preceded the American Revolution. They wanted to undo that entire awakening of that something very special that had happened within human culture in the 15th century, that for the first time saw human beings as being sacred and all of us being made in the image of God. And that would be the basis upon which that concept, that national laws would be crafted that would be considered viable and legitimate in opposition to unjust laws that recognize human beings as having no sacredness and no sacredness to life. So this question of will money serve, and will the laws that shape the behavior of profit, of money, of national priorities, would that be enshrined in the idea of life and mind as being sacred? Or would it be something to enslave us based on the idea that some are born slaves, some are born masters, and money thus being kind of like a hammer, just another tool to kill your neighbor instead of building a house? And so this is the thing that we're now dealing with, is that rigged game is now coming to its conclusion. The system is melting down, but unlike the case maybe a decade ago, or what is it today? It's 2022. Yeah, 2012, 10 years ago, it was relatively unchallenged, as I said at the beginning. There was one game run by the transatlantic rules-based international order, the New World Order, New World Orderistas, you could call them, that wanted to utilize the controlled demolition of the world system as an excuse to create shock therapy, traumatize the people, kind of like what happened in Weimar 1923, or it was done in Russia in the 1990s, but do it on a global level. And, in Weimar, it was hyperinflation, and it was done partially to destroy the currency, but partially to psychospiritually destroy the people who still had some sense of freedom, that had to be crushed in order to radicalize the people, create a climate that would be more conducive to growing fascism, which the pre-1923 German population never would have accepted. Fascist ideology, or eugenics, the science of racial purification.
Right. That started like what, 1900s? I mean, even in when did it start and where did it start? United States eugenics, or was it also like Scandinavian countries? I mean, everywhere. But it wasn't like. I mean, what's important, I think, for people to understand eugenics agenda, or what's that name? Mrs. Sanger.
Margaret Sanger, yeah.
Yeah, who I think she was quoted sometime. I read a quote of her, like, we should never let the Negro population, like the African American population, never know that we are pursuing this agenda, and it was sort of contrasted with a quote by Obama. I don't know, some years ago, where he said, well, which I'm just paraphrasing, we should somehow look up to Mrs. Sanger. I'm not sure what the context was, but even just mentioning or referencing Mrs. Sanger, I don't even know her first name.
Margaret Margaret Sanger.
Exactly. I mean, it's just so grotesque, and so that's what I was just going to say, is that the eugenics program, and that what you all always reiterated and explain in your articles and your interviews, it didn't start in Nazi Germany. that's the point. Yeah.
No, exactly, and yeah, that's horrifying, and it is a rich, disgusting irony that you have Obama saying this, so it didn't start in Nazi Germany. No, in fact, Nazi Germany, when they began their eugenics policies of, sterilizing the unfit, who deems what the unfit is, right there. That's already a problem. Who's going to judge who's the unfit? So they had certain metrics that they created premised around statistical analysis of people's family lineage that they could forecast into the future. They used probability theory to justify sterilizing people who had low IQs, criminal records, other things. And that was done modeled on legislation that had already been applied vigorously in the United States, where 30 states had already passed sterilization laws based on these so-called scientific principles of racial purification, and that's the human race as a whole. So though it was racially targeted as well, there was, it didn't matter if you were white or black, in the sense that you would be, if you were poor, you would face equal subjugation to the eugenics policies. But obviously, not all unfavored poor people are equal, and certainly, as Margaret Sanger pointed out, the darker skinned races were less favorable, and that was done. That was done quite a bit also to Native Americans, including those in Canada.
I mean, where people like Sanger, all these eugenics people, around, I mean, were they really convinced that what people with darker skin, whatever, or specific lineage or racial, ethnical, I mean, are less intelligent, or is somehow detrimental to the human race? What's the philosophy behind that? Just maybe briefly.
It's blatant tribal racism. It's like people of the superior tribe getting a little bit too drunk off their own egos and sense of superiority, and then looking for some scientific reasoning why they're superior. That's really what it comes down to. And it might have certain veneers of virtue that they clothe their argumentation around to make it seem more attractive, putting a bit of honey around the poison. But it really is this slimy, ugly thing, which just is an imperial ideology. And Margaret Sanger, for those who don't know, she is the founder of Planned Parenthood, a great, celebrity figure who's often promoted as being a great beacon, a heroine of the women's rights, women's liberation. Now,
and the father of Bill Gates, I think it's important to mention, right, was the director, what do you call it, president of Planned Parenthood?
He managed Planned Parenthood, Bill Gates Sr., for a number of years. A very close ally with David Rockefeller, as I mentioned, who worked with Henry Kissinger and Zbigniew to found the Trilateral Commission that conducted this financial coup in the early 70s. David Rockefeller was, again, a close Gates family associate. And again, like this was done specifically as a way to create a hierarchical caste system under a scientifically managed society. That was really the objective, and nobody would ever, or at least it was rare to hear anyone say it that way that I just said it, because if they did, no one would drink that poison. So they, of course, wrap it in what appears to be scientific lingo, mumbo jumbo, but it really was never that. And it was not even American. So even though it was American eugenics laws that Hitler modeled his program around, it was actually British. So Britain, as I mentioned, had fifth column deep state operations within the United States that had been there, and that they grew them since the American Revolution. Really, there were factions that never left. You had stay-behinds, and groups coming out of the late 19th century. Certain industrialists were absorbed into this British-run deep state. Among those were figures like Andrew Carnegie. The Rockefeller family was originally they started out as American industrialists, train barons and steel barons, and they found themselves rewarded by forces that existed on the other side of the ocean and had certain tasks assigned to them to carry out to undermine the nationalist traditions of the United States, which were always antithetical to the system of empire since the days of Washington, John Quincy Adams, Hamilton, Ben Franklin, Lincoln. You always had this constitutional principle that was something which British grand strategists understood if it were not only successfully made dominant in the USA, it would also spread to other countries, as was the case in Russia, which was adopting the protective tariff American system policies for internal development, state-backed national credit for the development of the Trans-Siberian Railway. I think you and I have talked about this in the past, but we saw this blossom in China, in Japan. After the Meiji Restoration, there was a fight whether it would go pro-American or pro-British. It ended up going pro-British under an Anglo-Japanese treaty that basically inflamed the worst elements of the samurai imperial ideology of Japan and turned them into a battering ram against Russia and other countries, as we saw in the 20th century. France, South America, Latin America. I mean, so many countries were adopting this in the 19th century, and this had to be destroyed. Because if this were not destroyed, you had a world of cooperating sovereign nation state actualizing their full potentials of their citizenry as participants in their government, as well as in humanity, as partaking in a non-zero sum mode of being, right? Creating new discoveries, transmitting those discoveries into new technologies. If that were permitted to thrive, then empire could not exist with all of its insidious techniques of divide to conquer, creating false famines, false wars, unnecessary scarcity that they need to do as a matter of empire that they've been doing for thousands of years to keep the slaves fighting each other and depopulated, living in smaller cages. So this is something which eugenics arose as a way to modify or extend certain new biological sciences that had been promoted by the British Empire in the late 50s, 60s, under the form of Charles Darwin and what was known as the Darwinian theory of natural selection as a way to find the mechanism. Because it's not like evolution isn't happening. It's the question of what was the mechanism that would explain how species change. That was the fight. And today, see, people, they lose the nuance. They think, oh, you have to be a Darwinian natural selectionist or a radical creationist who believes everything literally in the Bible. You have to pick one of the two camps. Mm-hmm. It's like, wait a minute. Mm-hmm. No, I don't. That's not the case at all. That's a false dichotomy. If you actually look at it, there was a big, robust fight in the 19th century as people were discovering fossils. They were starting to discover that there were these changes going back in geological time that had to be explained. We didn't see that things were just slowly changing gradually. We found instead, the more you dug, that the idea of gradualism was not the case. Evidence showed creative leaps, that systems would disappear, new systems would come into being. So again, what was the mechanism allowing for this? And also there was greater complexity, right? The new system that had mammals had a greater amount of robust complexity in the ecosystem and all of the relationships than the previous system did. That was more dominated by dinosaurs, and the previous system to that was even less complex. So there was like a seeming evidence of directionality, of creative orientation. And so Darwin was one of many different people kicking in a theory of what that mechanism was. Yet the other ones we're not told about today. James Dwight Dana, Lamarck, Cuvier, Karl Ernst von Baer, who did work on morphogenic fields, early morphogenic fields back in the 19th century. These were all contemporaries of Darwin, and they were coming out with their own explanations, which when you look at it today, some of them are very solid arguments. But what was Darwin doing? And this gets at eugenics, okay? I'm saying this for a reason. And eugenics is the heart of transhumanism. So in order to understand transhumanism and what is the inner religion of those freaks that did the coup d'etat that created the false rigged game in 1971 in order to create a controlled demolition to create shock therapy, to have people accept something that they would never accept as far as a global world government run by a managerial class above, above the masses, that would then depopulate the world, or have us willingly depopulate ourselves and dumb us down willingly. There's a certain religious belief structure which has a direct continuity, right? Going back, like I said, to the age of eugenics and the age of what I'm talking about now with the fight over Darwinianism, because eugenics was applying the Darwinian solution to human organization, because Darwin's theory was applied specifically to biology, not really dealing with so much humanity. And so Thomas Huxley, known as Darwin's bulldog, the grandfather of Aldous and Julian, who not quite coincidentally, especially Julian, was the founder of transhumanism. That's where the word itself came from, was Julian Huxley, 1954, the grandson, right? He was also the president of the British Eugenics Society, which
also
was renamed
Malthusian. I'm sorry to interrupt you. Is that also part of the, or is it connected to Malthusian agenda?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
But let's put that one aside for the moment, because there is a direct continuity. It's true from Malthus to Darwin to Galton to the transhumanists. That is there. Let's put that aside for the moment. So, or let's bring it in. We'll bring that in, okay? Because in Darwin's system, which said, okay, the mechanism is random mutations on the small. We're going to assume that there's these little mutations going on in living organisms all the time, randomly, like constant rolling of the dice. Again, the gambling allegory is not a coincidence. It's kind of like always happening very fast. And occasionally the dice will just roll sixes like a million times in a row. And what'll happen was that fortunate luck of the roll will result in a bigger claw for that species. And that bigger claw will allow that species to then beat out all of the weaker competing competitors in its genus or whatever, as they then die away, giving by that bigger claw's ability to have more food, more sex, in a world of diminishing returns. Because again, Darwin's system was a world that assumed British economic principles of diminishing returns, that it was a closed system, and because it's closed, there's the sum is its parts, right? The whole is the sum of its parts, and thus every time you have more activity, there is a diminishing amount of resources to be distributed to the competitors. So this is the Darwinian idea. And that scarcity, that tension, creates an impetus for more of the rolling of the dice, resulting in bigger attributes, faster feet, whatever, bigger peacock feathers, or that more colorful, whatever. So the whole thing is rooted into a sex drive and a survival drive for more pleasure and to spread the seed. And with that comes certain other assumptions like gradualism. So in the Darwinian view, there's no room for creative leaps. It's all assumed that everything is a slow, gradual modification over time. Now, the problem was evidence didn't show us that. We never see really those small, gradual changes. We see, like I said, leaps. We also don't see it as random. We see it as oriented towards not just increased complexity, but increased powers of action, increased free energy in the system. So, going from unicellular life 500 million years ago, when we saw only evidence of single-celled, boring, it was a very boring Earth, not very much cycling of atoms going from the atmosphere, from the what's called the lithosphere, the non-living sphere. Now I'm using the terminology here of a Russian biogeochemist named Vladimir Vernadsky. You have, everyone who just thinks for 2 seconds and just looks at how are atoms and molecules organized in nature. They're either organized by life, by non-life, or by mind, right? Everything around us right now is mind, like everything, including like my shirt, right? The atoms, the carbon in my shirt, the hydrocarbons in my microphone, in my cup, everything here is shaped by ideas and thoughts. These are like fossils of ideas that go back. We don't know the names for most of the people who made the discoveries, but so we live in what's called, as Vernadsky termed it, the noosphere, the noetic sphere, where atoms are shaped by the mind, thoughts. Then you have the living sphere, right? So like my plants also have carbon, but it's different from the carbon in a rock, right? The behavior of the carbon is animated in the case of my plant by life, or in the case of my body by life. In the case of the rock, no, it's more boring. So in the case of early life in the Precambrian, you had very little of those single-celled organisms absorbing material from the outside, expelling it from, processing it from within themselves, and then expelling it, back into the biosphere. It was very low-level activity. Now today, 500 million years ago, we see that it's a very high level of activity, right? There's a constant inhaling and expelling, right? In goes the oxygen, out goes the carbon dioxide. That's my process. That's our relationship with plant life. And this came about by new creative innovations.
Which is good. CO2 is good. That's what I'm saying.
CO2 is so good, and it was produced by the sun. Like it's people say, solar panels are so good, and it's like, not really. Compare the effectiveness of transforming, solar power light into and heat into work. Compare it to a leaf and chlorophyll. The chlorophyll molecule is magnitudes more effective than a photovoltaic cell could ever be. Like plants do it well. So we have this coherence, right, in the biosphere that we're a part of. And so Darwin just crushed all of that. None of that. Your mind isn't allowed to process the harmony of parts, the interrelationship and organizational orientation of change. There's no orientation. There is no directionality in the Darwinian system. It's because, again, randomness is a primary causal function. You don't think about the creative leaps. Whereas people, like I mentioned a few other names, right? James Dwight Dana, Carl Ernst von Boehner, Benjamin Silliman, Cuvier, Lamarck, they were all looking at these variables and bringing us into a real science of creative change, both in nature, but also then that could educate and explain what is it that humans actually do that's natural by being creative in that lawful way.
Can I ask you just a quick question? All these, most of these names, to be honest with you, I've never read anything of them, but I heard maybe here and there. Are these also, like it has happened last 100 years or so? Are these scientists, engineers, inventors? Are these part of the group of people who have been systematically suppressed or?
Oh yeah.
Censored, right?
Oh sure. Yeah, you can read some of their writings, but you're not allowed to study any of their theories in school. Yeah. No, you lose your job as a teacher if you try to actually promote or encourage your students to actually study a lot of these individuals. So now we have now basically the gist of what was Darwin doing. Now Darwin couldn't actually sell his own ideas. He couldn't defend his ideas. They were based on mathematical, not really principles of physics, but mathematical argumentation. He couldn't really defend it in public, and that's why he needed Thomas Huxley. Huxley was somebody who was a talented misanthropic person who was brought into the upper echelons. He was discovered, talent searched, and given more power, more privilege, because he was good. He had aptitudes that the empire had lacked, because the problem with empires is they tend to get crusty over time, and the upper level echelons of the master class tend to lose that creative vitality over time, especially their kids get more decadent, and that always happens. That was the problem of the British Empire of the 19th century. They couldn't compete with the innovative creative ideas that were being driven, especially by the American Revolution. So Huxley was brought in. He founded an organization called the X Club to promote Darwinian ideas. They founded a magazine called Nature Magazine, still today a very popular magazine. That's its origins. And he started basically arranging public debates with Anglican fanatics who were supposedly opponents of Darwinism, but they were too dumb to actually debate anything scientifically. And so by manufacturing these false debates, always highly publicized by the media that was working very closely with him, he then ridiculed and destroyed his opponents and won over greater converts to the Darwinian mode of thinking. Now, Darwin, in this mix, now keep in mind, Huxley would never arrange a debate with any of the sorts of competent scientists of the von Humboldt school of Germany or anything like that, who I mentioned. They would never do that. It was always with fanatics. That's the one thing. That's like getting Tony Blair to defend Christianity against a globalization-loving economist. Tony Blair today has become sort of the champion for Christianity and globalization. And they made this big, highly publicized debate where it's like, why are you going to pick Tony Blair to defend Christianity against an atheist? Of course, the result was Tony Blair lost his debate. Of course. But a lot of people who don't know what the hell is going on just watch Tony Blair's lame argumentation, and they're like, oh yeah, I guess atheism is the way to go. And it's useful for them to do things like that. Now, Darwin, you mentioned Malthus. Darwin, in his autobiography, admits that the theory that gave him the idea of, or the solution to natural selection and the race for diminishing, in a world of diminishing rates of return, was in 1838. He writes how he chanced, while I believe he was voyaging in the Beagle, somebody gave him, probably Thomas Huxley, I would imagine, I don't know, but somebody gave him a copy of Thomas Malthus's 1799 Essays on the Principle of Population. And he said, it was thus by greater appreciating these factors of how there is a constant race and tension for diminishing returns that I finally was given a theory by which to work. And he admits that that's the foundation stone upon which his structure is built. Now, if you read Thomas Malthus is a satanic figure. He's not a scientist. He's not an economist, though, and he passes himself off as a reverend of the Church of England, of the Anglican Church. He was a teacher at the British East India Company's Haileybury College, who produced a mathematical pseudoscientific formula for managing population growth by an elite, with the idea that as population grows geometrically, agriculture only reproduces or grows arithmetically, resulting in a Malthusian crisis. And that mathematical ratio gives mathematicians at the top of the pyramid the tools needed to calculate not only when that crisis is going to happen, but to mitigate or act preventatively long before it happens, to keep the human population, the global herd, in check, utilizing, as Malthus says, cutting off support for the unfit, including children, as he says that no parish should supply assistance to any family that has more than one child. After your first child, there should be all support cut off. He calls for encouraging the return of the plague, the utilization of wars to keep the populations in check. He thinks these are all like the natural gifts of nature that the scientists have to use and manage in what became known rightfully as the dismal science. So that's where the British economy school, and here I'm talking about Ricardo, John Stuart Mill, James Mill, all of the great so-called economists who were taught in school today. If you study micro macroeconomics or business, these are the people that you're taught, are the British economists. Adam Smith.
And the one-child policy in China, is that founded on this, yes. I don't know, pseudos?
Yes. Oh, yeah, well, this is the thing.
In the past, of course, it's not valid anymore. There is no one-child policy anymore, right?
No, they got rid of it in 2015. Oh. They lifted it to 2. Then last year they lifted it to 3. And I think under the current planning is to finally abolish it by the end of the 2030. Because the Chinese have at least recognized the failure, the destructiveness that they did to themselves by this policy. But it wasn't entirely themselves, because it was done largely because of the neo-Malthusian revivalists like Henry Kissinger, who managed the new plan that extracted U.S. industries and put them in China as part of this slave master new set of relations that Kissinger wanted to create. So China would remain in Kissinger's mind, and those like David Rockefeller, who managed a lot of conferences in China, in Beijing in the 1970s and 80s, their idea was that China was going to remain just porant. Basically, they would just be the forever sweatshop of the world, forever underdeveloped, with only a rich, deep state billionaire class that would manage locally the slaves, the masses of poor of China, forever on behalf of their controllers in London and some in Washington, but mostly London. That was always supposed to be the forever crystallized model. Now, part of that was bringing in the Club of Rome, which was something that was created in 1969, 68 by a couple of eugenics-loving Malthusians, specifically Aurelio Pichai and who ran Volkswagen, the Volkswagen Foundation, as well as Alexander King, who was a very high-level British imperial manager. And these guys created this new organization as a way to popularize the idea that computer modeling will help us control population levels and calculate the optimal population for the Earth, which their computer models that were sponsored by, they sponsored a study called The Limits to Growth, run by two MIT mathematicians, Jay Forrester and Dennis Meadows, that was produced in 1972. Ironically, with Canadian money, Canadian taxpayer money funded the study because the Canadian branch of the Club of Rome was sponsored by none other than Pierre Elliott Trudeau, who's a big Club of Rome fanatic, and the Governor General, Roland Michener, who was another Rhodes Scholar. The Governor General of Canada was another co-founder of this thing, and were quite a few others in Canada, including Maurice Strong, one of the co-founders of the World Economic Forum. Now, that this model was given its first platform to be popularized at the second meeting of the World Economic Forum, which was managed by Henry Kissinger's protege, Klaus Schwab, who had been a student under Kissinger in Harvard, and also
just for our listeners, funded by the CIA, right? I mean, this whatever school of.
This is on Whitney Webb's website, Unlimited Hangout. There's a wonderful article on this. It's really quite good. Mm-hmm. But yeah, the CIA completely funded this school within Harvard. Yes, and Kissinger himself, keep in mind, he was the teacher of Schwab, but at the same time, he was himself the student and was mentored by what's his name? A Rhodes Scholar, William Yandell Elliott. So Yandell Elliott was sort of the Milner, Cecil Rhodes type of character who had his own kindergarten, just like Milner had his kindergarten in South Africa in the early 1900s, with all these young sociopathic boys always that he just cultivated and who worshipped him and who became the managers of the Round Table movement. It's the same thing for all of these. This is a template that's utilized. And this is what William Yandell Elliott managed. Some of his young boys included Kissinger was one of his favorites, but also you had Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was another one of the Yandell Elliott boys. So was Pierre Elliott Trudeau was a William Yandell Elliott boy. They all had different roles to play in the great game, of course, but they were all part of the same little Rhodes Scholar nexus. So this is this is happening in the 1940s, 50s, and then. So the World Economic Forum is created. They popularize the limits to growth. They bring in Aurelio Pichai to present his computer models to the world. It takes a while for it to sort of become national policy. Most nations still don't want to do this. They still want to have industrial development instead, because it's like, you could solve your useless eater overpopulation problem two ways. One, kill the people, right? The way Malthus says, or the eugenicists who took the Malthus Darwin policies and applied it now to a science of population control, purifying the gene pool, which is what Galton did, by combining it with certain Mendelian genetic ideas, which were some of those ideas were fine, but the application of it was horrifyingly unscientific, but it was imperial. So that's one thing. You could kill your useless eaters and overpopulated people, or you could, like I said, make the useless eaters become useful creators. And that involves providing industrial growth, providing education, providing a climate of hope. And when you do these things, you create fertile soil for the proper potentialities of the seed to blossom as it should, which is where a lot of the governments of the world were still trying to push in that direction. So they didn't like, it wasn't popular to have this Malthusian computer modeling system in place, and so the World Economic Forum was an amplifier for that. And when Kissinger went into China, there was a series of mathematicians, cyberneticists in China who were absorbed by the Kissinger trilateral apparatus. They were brought to some Scandinavian conferences, introduced to the Club of Rome models. And one figure was Song Ji, father of Chinese rocket science and engineering. He did some good things, but he was really brainwashed on this thing. And he brought back the Club of Rome computer models as the solution to the overpopulation projections that were being made, and they were all showing very scary, if every mother in China is producing, an average of 5 kids or maybe more, sometimes often more, you could project that linearly and say, okay, by the year 2000, you're going to have, like some scary number. And look, you don't have any development. That's going to be a complete dark age. That'll be an Armageddon. And so these scared people sufficiently that then the Chinese leadership acquiesced to making this one of the accepted conditions upon which they would receive World Bank and IMF funding, as well as U.S. factories, because they were desperately in need of having some form of factories or industrial growth, especially after the destruction of the Cultural Revolution, which was a big self-mutilation. I mean, China was hurting badly from that experience. So that is part of the recovery process. They needed the industry, but the condition was do the one-child thing. So it wasn't even an indigenously Chinese policy ever, even at the beginning. It was always brought in and enforced upon them by these external forces who both wanted to destroy China ultimately and keep them a slave society, as well as destroy Russia, as well as destroy the United States. It's the same operatives who are not nationally bounded anywhere. They just utilize their fifth columns in any country to achieve their objective, which is total feudalism. That's their objective, including dumbed down, deindustrial, underpopulated, human talking cows. So all that to say, this is what Galton did. He was the first to sort of say, and he had many speeches, the cousin of Darwin who formulated eugenics, that the science of eugenics, he said, I see no reason why this should not become a replacement for the religions of the world, why we cannot have a new religion of eugenics. And the governing class that he was a part of made it their religious-like motive to not only have a version of this for themselves, but also subversions of it for the masses, because you couldn't let every level of the hierarchy of society, every caste, in on the same degree of the religion, right? You can't let them all in. So you have to have these versions that are just diluted. And that's why when you listen to the popularized, dumbed down Darwinism that we're teaching our kids in most universities, it's a very different approach to thinking about it than the governing class with their transhumanist ideology learns and believes in. There's similarities, but there's also things that are very different. The merging of human beings of biology with machines, right? To make us relevant going into the new age of CRISPR genetic manipulation or artificial intelligence replacing human beings. So you got all of these different flavors of the same ultimate thing, which is anti-creative. It's based on a closed system ideology that whatever exists now is all that ever could exist. And so we have to ban things that cause disequilibrium. And it is in total opposition to what we currently see. And I mentioned this at the beginning. I didn't finish my thought, but at the very beginning, I mentioned 10 years ago, the current collapsing rigged game was the only game in town. Today, there's an opposing system to the closed rigged game that's that is being demolished. And that other system actually is viable because it's founded on certain principles. And that article you referenced by Larry Romanov on my website is one of many ways of looking at this system of bountiful creative change.
Wow, fascinating. Yeah, we should go into that. I mean, whenever you're finished with that thread.
So yeah, it's the Eurasian system. If people want to get a sense of it, read the speeches of the Eurasian Economic Union Summit that just happened on.
Yeah, you mentioned that like a couple of times now in your last interviews. It was Iran also involved in that,
yeah.
or
they were. I think they had observers there.
Okay.
They're not part of the Eurasian Economic Union, but they are highly integrated into the greater Eurasian partnership of Russia, China, Iran. India is increasingly on board. Pakistan
Can you give
is
like a short background? Like, what's the objective? What's the purpose of this whole Eurasian thing?
It's a survivors. Well, first and foremost, it started off in the late 90s, which was what became the G20, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization of Russia, China, were the foundation stones. And again, it started off as a survivors club in response to the growing New World Order in the post-Cold War age. And it has, especially in the last 7-8 years, really grown fast, especially since the Belt and Road Initiative became the official foreign policy of China, with a completely alternative system of balance of payments, alternatives to SWIFT, built by Russia, by China, that are increasingly allowing for the settlement of payments and of trade in local currencies instead of US dollars. It's increasingly based not on speculative activities of the casino economy, but it's based on the creation of real commodities, the digging up like gold, wheat, finished goods. So you actually have real metrics in the real world justifying the behavior of the monetary system there, which it has increased. Like I said, Iran has joined the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. The Eurasian Economic Union has increasingly integrated with China under several treaties since 2015 to create a new sort of bloc. That's 6 countries of the Eurasian Economic Union plus China. Glaziev, a leading economic scientist and advisor to Putin, is in charge largely of macroeconomic integration of Eurasia. And what's most important is it's based upon certain concepts of intercivilizational cooperation. So rather than seeing things in the Western paradigm of borders of nation states that fight for local self-interest, there is an idea of the sovereignty of nations, but more importantly, it's being superseded by an idea of civilizational force, that there's these ancient civilizations representing cultural, linguistic, ethnic, religious groups, but that have a harmonious coexistence as human beings first. It's very antithetical to everything that critical race theory represents, right? Which is that there is no unifying characteristic of human beings. You are your primary identity is your gender, is your sub whatever or whatever gender you want to create for yourself, right, is your primary identity. Whatever skin tone you are, that's your primary identity. However abused you are by some abuser, other race, usually white males, that's who you are. The idea that there's something universal is completely antithetical to the critical race theory, politically correct liberal order, which is the ethic of the rules-based international order. It's the open society of Soros. Everything is so open that there is no truth, right? Everything is true. We accept all truths as being equal, except those truths or except those opinions that say that they're right. So we respect every single gender as being having equal claim to truth. All 5,000 genders. Except those opinions that say that there's just male and female. If that's the case, that's tyrannical, authoritarian, and must be destroyed. So all that to say, the idea of the Eurasian alliance has a different ethical, philosophical, political, economic, and security paradigm built into it, and it has a military component of mutual defense. It's not offensive, but it's defensive. That's why China has only one military base outside of China. And hasn't started any wars in the past century. I think maybe one circumstantial thing in the 70s with Vietnam, but that's messy. The U.S. has started what? I don't even know how many wars, right? How many? It has like 900 bases outside of its own borders.
Yeah.
So it's that, plus it's the idea of banking is founded upon long-term thinking, low interest loans, and cooperation with, look at the high-speed rail networks. There's almost 40,000 kilometers built in China now in the past 20 years. 23 years ago, there was 0. Now there's 40,000. That's growing at a geometric rate.
Are these
Russia
also part of the maglev trains, like in Japan? Definitely a little high speed, right? Okay.
Yeah, like China has a lot. These are high speed. This means we're talking here between 300 to 600 kilometers an hour speeds, super fast. You can go to Beijing to Shanghai in like 3.5 hours. It's a huge thing. That would take those same distances in Canada, where we have 1950s rail tech, no high speed. That same distance would take upwards of something like 14 hours or so to make that same transit. So the idea of space time itself is bending in a sort of very specific way. You have a compression of space-time, and that's what good human economies are supposed to be. The more human beings gain knowledge of the universe, what we see going back to ancient times, that the universe responds, it resonates to our true ideas that we put into action by giving us a power of greater integration, greater speed at which goods are both created, move, and are consumed. And you have what's called an increased community of principle of producers and consumers interfacing together in space and in time. And new technologies allow this to happen, where, let's say, electricity allows for the communication of signals, first in telegraph and then in words, in spoken words, vocally. That allows all of a sudden things that had taken formerly, 4 months or whatever, I don't know how long, to send a letter from Europe to New York. Maybe it's probably more like a month. All of a sudden, that speed takes minutes to today, split seconds, And so what we have now in China, especially with quantum computing coming online, high-speed rail, maglev is increasingly coming online, and is an idea of both applying technology and the money associated with the behavior of technology's investments into things that both benefit individual investors while at the same time benefit the national structures as a whole. So that type of both coherence of a whole, which requires stability, as well as the flexibility of change, which is usually the opposite of stability, right? It's hard to balance the two, but you need the two. You need to be both have responsibility as well as desire, right? As an individual, the duty freedom paradox. That's the same problem for a nation. How do you cherish the need for each individual to have freedom and creative expression, while at the same time having a stability and coherence of the nation's structures and administration as a whole? So China's they're doing a pretty good job finding that balance. Russia's a little bit further behind, but they're also moving in the right orientation. They've done a better job of de-weeding their deep state garden, their fifth columnists, than we have. In our case, our fifth columnists are running our policies. In the case of Eurasia, they're either extracted and burnt, subdued, or they're in negligible positions currently. They're there in China, they're there in Russia, in many cases waiting to take control at the first opportunity, but they're not driving the ship. So that's a very different point of differentiation, of discernment, that people have to have in mind going into this, because that's the only boat that floats. The current boat that we're in is designed to be a Titanic. It's right. The hull had built-in structural deficiencies that were designed to tank at the slightest poke, and now the poke is happening. So we're tanking. If we're going to have survival for humanity, it will be because we harmonize our interests with what is currently happening with the Arctic development strategies of Russia, the consolidation. I mean, Putin is using the opportunity of the developments in Ukraine right now, certainly, to consolidate as much power as he can. There's still a lot of fight back and pushback, especially amongst groupings within the Russian central bank, which is contaminated with a lot of IMF affiliated operatives. So there's a fight happening there. We see it between the Glaziev faction, right, which represents real patriots, real nationalists. I know for a fact that Putin is definitely a part of that one, but at the same time, there's power structures that are defending the enemies of the nationalists. Again, congealing around the big pharmaceutical companies that are tied to the World Health Organization in Russia, as well as the banking complex of the Bank of Russia, which is still a private bank. Unlike China, China has been able to maintain its state controls over its banks. It did not allow them to be privatized in the 90s. Russia failed to do that. So they have a different element of fight. But yeah, I mean, again, Iran is increasingly on board. We know Syria, a lot of countries of Southwest Asia, pretty much everybody who was not invited to Biden's, Global Democracy Summit has their hearts and minds in that other more viable paradigm, including South America, including much of Africa. So that's the fight today. Darwinian versus anti-Darwinian systems of social organization.
You talk sometimes about maybe it's a more general definition, but you talk maybe about the unipolar versus the multipolar. Now, to be honest, I'm not a fan of either of those because, in long term, you know, I mean, I get it, you know, that, for example, let's just, for the sake of it, you know, let's just name Russia, or Putin himself is not like, he's anti, you know, anti-transhumanist, or anti, you know, this old new world order agenda. But would you say, because you know, you sometimes mention in your interviews, well, what they like about China, you know, is what they love to adopt is you know, the surveillance, the social credit system, the technocratic system, but not the industrialization, the productivity and stuff like that. So, but in the long term, I mean, isn't it more like, in general, whether, you know, whoever, with whatever faction or structure wins or overwhelms the system globally, would you say that it's, you know, it's more about, at the end of the day, it's about control. It's about, you know, exerting your control, you know, or their control structures.
Okay. Well, the way I'd answer this, look, is I have both my ideals of like where I believe personally, like I have certain theories of where I see our healthy society being in the future. And then I have the real world that I live in with its real power structures and real intentions that currently exist, which is quite a few steps removed from what I believe to be our eventual age of maturation as a proper species, self-aware of our own nature, acting in accordance with natural law. So I have my ideals, but I'm not so committed to just thinking in an ivory tower way that I cannot see the practical battles happening currently. And there's like real hardcore fights happening in my world today, with certain realities. So based on that, yeah, I believe that personally, in time, as human beings, as culture matures and self-perfects, that the individuals within the culture, every individual, because culture is sort of the spiritual field, it's not just art, music, literature, philosophy, it's all of this invisible, rich field that shapes the cultivation of our souls. It's the soil in which the seed of our soul will grow or will be stifled, is culture. As that grows properly, the individuals within, I believe, will increasingly come earlier and earlier to the recognition that their duties, that they're right with the things we so-called must do as part of being a social species, are actually reasonable and even desirable, and that the satisfaction, the pleasure our souls get when we act in wisdom, making discoveries, sharing discoveries, doing good works for others, you know, all the things that make us better spiritually, psychologically, are actually superior forms of pleasure than the pleasures of the flesh, cake, sex, other things. Those are fine. I'm not saying don't have sex, don't have cake, but I'm saying that it's an inferior order of pleasure than the higher pleasures, and you'd be willing to sacrifice those lower pleasures in order to preserve the higher pleasures. And that sort of, it's a Confucian idea as well, learning to place the values where they should be, correcting the words that you use and placing the words in the right set of parameters and the right values, right? So you don't value things that shouldn't be valued. You value things that should be valued, right? So all that to say, as that society does grow, I think that there will be less need to have systems of laws that command us to do what we should do, right? You don't need that if people want to do what they should do. Increasingly, they have wisdom. You don't need to have such, laws like that. It's like, like Jesus said when he was asked by a rabbi who was trying to trick him, like, what's the most important of the 10 commandments? And he did a creative answer. He said, well, to love God and love your fellow man, like you love yourself. And so he didn't answer any of these negative thou must or must not laws, which is perfectly fine to have those must and must not laws. If people are confused, it's like, yeah, it's right there, but it's not bad to kill your neighbor because the law says don't kill. It's bad because of there's a deeper reason. And it just so happens to be that the law says don't do it. So snap in, right? Whereas Christ said, well, love God, love your fellow man. And if you do those things, you obey the golden rule, all of the other things will follow. So he made it a positive thing, right? Love. And so I think it's like that for laws. People will want to engage in things that have greater value. So, okay, back to your question. I think that at certain times when societies, here's a problem. When the society goes into a situation where the population is dumbed down, where the masses don't know how to control themselves, the individual loses the sense of priorities of like what's right, what's wrong, who am I, what gender am I. When you have that type of decay, or also when you have a process where you're under attack, like where you have an enemy that wants to destroy you and the population doesn't understand it or know how to react, sometimes that society has a choice. They could either collapse, they could just be destroyed, let the hordes come in, or sometimes you will have the necessity for like a strong person might have to come in sometimes and restore order, and it might seem like personal liberties are being infringed in order to preserve the nation, the civilization, and the ultimate well-being of the people. But they don't know that sometimes. That's sometimes what happens. So it's not always bad. In the case of China today, there is social credit, which I find distasteful, and there's a surveillance state, which I find distasteful. The problem is China has been under, there is an intention to destroy China. There is a war against China, which has a multifaceted, asymmetrical dynamic to it. There's thousands of organizations that have infiltrated through various NED, CIA operations that have been trying for decades now to break up China by creating and inflaming separatist movements using ethno-nationalist ideologies, whether it's in Tibet or Xinjiang or Southern Mongolia or Hong Kong or Taiwan, or there's a few others. There's so much effort to create. They're doing the same thing. They've done the same thing in the U.S. They've been trying to do it in Russia to create 14 microstates under Zbigniew Brzezinski's ethno-nationalist divided micro nations of Russia, all beholden to the IMF. They've been doing the same thing to China, divide to conquer. China has had to fight against that. They've had to fight against fifth columnists embedded within the Chinese Communist Party. This is what Xi Jinping has been cracking down on since 2012, when the biggest anti-corruption program was ever put into place. Like 1.5 million members of the Chinese Communist Party have been either some have been arrested, some have been completely taken down they've been kicked out of the party, all of their privileges have been removed. People like Jack Ma, who's a World Economic Forum freak, a trustee, has been, he called for pretty much a financial insurrection, a coup in China, and he was, taken down from power. So they have these things. A lot of this is being directed by MI6, by the CIA. Like HSBC still runs they print the money for Hong Kong, right? People think, oh yeah, Hong Kong is not British anymore. It's like, no, it's called the CIA of the Pacific for a reason. HSBC, that's based in London, still prints Hong Kong money. That's what's on Hong Kong.
Not to mention the trillions of money laundering, not only through HSBC, but throughout so many other banks and central banks. But
yeah, so you have all of this stuff to destroy China on top of the military encirclement to create a NATO of the Pacific with saber rattling, 50,000 U.S. troops with the U.S. military industrial complex stationed in Japan. You got another 28,000 with bioweapons as well, based in South Korea. You have a lot of evidence that that there's been a lot of biolab shady activity that has been deployed already for the past 20 years from South Korea. Or no, Obama started these programs in 2010, Jupiter and Centaur.
That have been Ukraine. How many biolabs are there? I mean,
over 30. Over 30.
Jesus Christ. Okay.
There's another similar amount in Georgia. So all that to say, if we don't know what China would be today if there wasn't a war to destroy them on so many levels. Unfortunately, because they've had to both, keep their system from disintegrating, to extract all of these millions of operatives and agencies masquerading under religious organizations affiliated with something that wants to kill them. And other humanitarian organizations that actually have very insidious motives. So they have this whole thing. And we see how it's taken control of the United States. We've seen how these things have taken control successfully of Europe. And yet, they've had to do certain, bring online certain things. The question is, are those things evil because of what they are, as far as mass surveillance and social credit, or are they evil based upon their intention to enslave and destroy? Are they perpetual? Is this something that I see evidence that China would always do? Or is this something that's part of a weapon used in battle currently?
Can I ask, would you comment, because there's, when it comes to human rights and because Alex Gladstein, one of the Bitcoiners and from the Human Rights Foundation, Oslo, was a beautiful conference like recently. I mean, he often talks about the Uyghurs, how do you pronounce it?
Uyghurs.
Yeah, I mean, the million Uyghurs who've been imprisoned or enslaved, I don't know, and maybe even exploited, or their organs taken out in China. I mean, what's up with that? I mean, how much truth is I mean, why is that in the first place? Why? Yeah.
No, I think it's a lot of Freudian projection. I mean, we're taking things that we do, like, I mean, America has the biggest private prison system using slave labor.
Right. Exactly.
In the world, where most of these people working for the military industrial complex, because a lot of the equipment that's used by the military of the United States is produced in prison slave labor camps where people get paid 25 cents to 30 cents a day, or no, sorry, an hour, but still, come on. Judges across the United States, there's been several who have been found guilty for taking bribes from the prison industrial complex.
Yeah. Corruption runs deep.
Yeah, for like assigning juvenile delinquents for doing petty crimes to sentences that destroy their lives up to 10 years so that they could just be cheap labor. So we've been doing this on the biggest scale ever in modern history, as far as I could see. And as you know, and the incarceration levels are the highest per capita of any developed country in the United States. So, I mean, we've got this thing, and we're doing what's called, again, Freudian projection. Is you do what you do, and then there's all sociopaths and narcissists do that. They take their own worst traits and they project it onto their enemy that they want to destroy, despite the fact that their enemy that they want to destroy may not have any of those problems. So in fact, yeah, when you do Scratch, Gray Zone has done some wonderful research on and exposés debunking a lot of the narratives that we're being fed about what China is doing with organ harvesting of the Falun Gong practitioners, or using slave labor in Xinjiang. There's a lot of work to debunk that, and that's almost a show unto itself. But I would say if people want to dig into that, these arguments, or the debunking of it, takes up 5 chapters of my new book on towards the Eurasian Manifest Destiny, volume 3
yeah,
of my Clash of the Two Americas series. So I think like chapters 23 to 30 all tackle this in various ways, including mapping out the Chinese and Russian deep state operations.
Fantastic.
Yep. And so again, I could tell you just very quickly, it's bunk. Like if you're being told that this is the case, that China is utilizing the organs, that they're just like kidnapping Falun Gong people who are, it's kind of like a Scientology cult, by the way, with a leader who's based in the USA, in Philadelphia, and a giant compound, a multi-billionaire who has a multifaceted hydra of corporations, media outlets, and other things, including a religion under his own name, Li Hongji. And he's been provided sanctuary in this giant estate in the USA. He has all the profiles of a MK Ultra type operative who believes he is like a messiah, of the brother of Christ, who is doing battle with aliens, interdimensional aliens, fighting over good and evil, and he is the conduit keeping balance in the cosmos. He actually believes this stuff. It's very similar to L. Ron Hubbard's ideology.
Oh, really?
Very similar. It's like a Chinese version of it. Okay. And it just masquerades under these meditation, qigong techniques to attract a lot of gullible white people mostly into it. But then, yeah, you start discovering later on that he actually has this whole cosmology. He's a nut job, but it's a CIA operation to destroy China culturally, as are many operations of the sort. And Xinjiang, I'll just say it very quickly, China shares a 70-kilometer border with Afghanistan, and they have had hundreds of terrorist attacks since 9/11. It wasn't just the West facing these things. Mm-hmm. These terrorists are being funded by the CIA, by Saudi Arabia and other operatives, and were created in the first place by Zbigniew Brzezinski, a star of our show, Trilateral Commission Brzezinski. in the first place to fight the Soviet Union by funding radical madrasas that would radicalize young jihadis, which gave birth to Al-Qaeda. So China has dealt with this. They've had, again, many Chinese die of terrorist incidents. They had to deal with this thing. They chose to not bomb any country back to the Stone Age in their approach to dealing with their terrorist problem. Keep in mind, again, they have much more self-interest with sharing a border with Afghanistan than America does half the world away, bombing that country back to the Stone Age. So they did it in a different way. And that involved basically cutting off Saudi funding to the Wahhabite most radicalized interpretations of the Quran. That was radicalizing a lot of young people and radical imams that were recruiting people to go and fight against the Russians in Syria and against Bashar al-Assad. And again, a lot of Uyghurs fight in Syria. A lot of fought and do fight in Iraq as part of Al-Qaeda operations. That's part of the reality that we live in. So that had to be stopped. They have, despite that, not crushed the Muslim culture by any means. There's over 24,000 mosques in Xinjiang, as well as another several hundred churches, Christian churches, both Catholic and Protestant. There's Taoist temples, Buddhist temples. There is no crushing of religion. It's just that part of the Chinese constitution is that you cannot receive it as a religious organization. You are not allowed to receive foreign money. That's part of the Chinese constitution of 1983. It says directly, you cannot receive foreign money to be a foreign agency inside masquerading as a religion, because that's destroyed China even going back to the 19th century with the various civil wars that they had to deal with in the 1850s, 60s. And you have to have a license. So you have to have basically you have to be approved by the state. They still use the Bible, they use the Quran, they use Buddhist scriptures. And as far as the cheap labor thing, no. I mean, you have right now trade schools, like what they do have for the worst elements, like the people who were the most radicalized and indoctrinated into jihadism and like the worst elements of radical Islamic terrorism. Yeah, they've had centers where you can't leave until you really show your stuff that you're repenting and living a new life. But for the most part, there's high-speed rail. There's more infrastructure being developed in Xinjiang than ever before in history. It plays a key role as a bridge between the Silk Road and Afghanistan, Pakistan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, everywhere else. There's more development happening. There's been something like 1,000% increase in per capita GDP. The average life expectancy 60 years ago went from about 39 years of age till today. Now it's about 71. There is faster internet than there is here, but there's also cultural centers. They're not crushing the traditions or the language of the Uyghurs, the Uyghur Muslims.
Okay, but just to round this up with the question with the Uyghur, I mean, how much truth is there? I mean, is there, actually like 1 million Uyghurs, like however you pronounce it, in camps or in prison?
No.
Or is it all like
you scratch on those arguments? No, there's not. If you scratch on the arguments, they fall apart. It's all accusation and repetition, and they use some shady satellite images where they're like, oh, look at that. That's a camp. Look, there's like a wall around that must be a concentration camp. And they tell you what you're looking at. But then when you actually look at the evidence of what you've just been shown, it turns out to be a school. And most schools that I have in Canada have fences around the school. So they misframe. It's narrative reframing and then utilizing emotionally charged images out of context to get you in a state of hysteria that activates some prejudices that Westerners have about big, bad, godless, atheistic China, which has been put there since the Cold War, which they're just reactivating and playing our emotions. But it's just emotional thinking. It's not actually evidence. And everything I've looked at, every time I scratch on a claim, I find it just falls apart.
Interesting. So is there anything substantial, that you would criticize about China or the policies, how they conduct themselves? I mean, something that's really so grotesque or so atrocious.
There's a few things. I mean, look, I think that China is... they're not willing to, it's kind of like a traumatized family. And what people who have gone through trauma in a family unit, they will often see the problem of like, we don't talk about that. But, look what Uncle Bill did to my sister, It's like, no, we don't talk about that. Or what's like an abusive narcissistic father figure or something, like, and that did a lot of terrible damage to and the only way to recover is to have that open conversation about what went wrong. How did we allow this to happen for so long? Whatever that trauma is, right? So it's really, I don't think, healthy to avoid that conversation and pretend everything's peachy keen for, I think that in my analysis, I might piss off some of my Chinese friends, but I think that there should be a lot more openness to discuss the mistakes of the past. Russia is much better at that. But they're afraid.
I mean, most people are afraid. I mean, especially if you live in China, you can't have talks. You can't have open talk. I mean, maybe if you are, live outside in foreign countries. I mean,
it's not as bad as you think, man. I mean, you're allowed to. It's just if you're in a position of influence, like if you're somebody who has power, then there's more accountability to you speaking in ways that are overly critical of China.
Yeah.
However, like for the most part, your average person in China is allowed to say whatever they want to say. There's very little retribution to just having opinions. And I got a lot of people I know who have all sorts of problems. Some people even work for Chinese news who they don't believe in the zero COVID policy. I don't believe in it. I think that that's a stupid thing. However, they're not getting fired. They're not getting destroyed. Their social credit rating is not being diminished. For those people who have done things that I've known who have had social credit scores diminished. And again, I'm not a fan of social credit. Okay. I'm just saying it's there. You can recover it relatively easily. Like it's very easy to recover social credit. Unlike the type of we have social credit already in North America, right? Like if you went to a freedom convoy protest for your freedoms in Ottawa, your bank accounts were frozen.
Yeah.
That's a new, if you do something or say something that the government doesn't like, you will be censored. You can be fired. There's people who are still in prison right now in the US for just having presented themselves at a January 6th protest in Washington. There's people who are unhirable. They've gone bankrupt several times. And when you go bankrupt, it's not easy to get out of having no credit, right? You can't get a loan. Your life is really shackled. And that is something you're stuck to.
It's another form of social. Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's hypocritical, I think. There's a lot of hypocrisy and lack of humility in looking at our own problems before trying to cast blame on the problems we see from China. Again, oftentimes without context. And so I think that China could do better at talking about more openly the self-mutilation that had happened under things like the Cultural Revolution. That was you're allowed to say it was a bad decision. That's now people were given the liberty in the 70s by Deng Xiaoping to say, okay, we're allowed to criticize. We're allowed to say Mao is not a god. We're allowed to criticize that Cultural Revolution as being a bad decision. But to really flesh it out, how did that happen? How did Zhao Ziyang, George Soros's agent, become the president, the head of the Chinese Communist Party from 1987 to 89, and before that premier? How did that happen? Because to treat everything as if it's been a progressive step towards a great just society from the 1911 revolution to the present with no errors along the way creates, I think, false confidence, a lot of blind spots about what your own weaknesses are that could be capitalized by your enemies, and a population which doesn't think as critically as it needs to. So I think that needs to be one thing that could definitely change. The other things, like I said, I think that the zero COVID policy, I don't think that that's wise. However, at the same measure, there's battles happening that I don't fully understand. So I know that China has chosen, as has Russia, to not directly call out the fraud of man-made global warming. They've chosen not to. They're going along with the narrative that has been thrust on the world that human beings are causing.
Yeah, this is one example I don't understand. Yeah.
On the one hand, if I would like to see national governments call out the crap and the fake science of that whole thing, and simply just say this is bunk. This is a depopulation agenda to destroy humanity. I would like to hear people say that in political power.
Yeah, why don't they? Why?
Well, I think that as soon as they do that, as soon as you call out the game like that, you're basically at World War III mode now, because you're pretty much saying any type of chance of having diplomatic maneuverability with your opponents which is the Eurasian approach right now to foreign policy, is to try to find, they're trying to resonate with sanity. They've provided us as many opportunities to find something sane within ourselves that they can negotiate with and talk to.
But aren't we already close to World War III? I mean, Matthew, this is what was
that's the thing.
When they, I mean, they are literally provoking a World War III. I mean, or is it just a theater?
They're provoking World War III, and I agree. Like, since February, things have accelerated on a much faster track than they were. Things were moving fast before that, but it shifted gears and went faster down that spiral. Now, the oligarchy would prefer to avoid World War III. That is not a favorable scenario outcome of the launching of thermonuclear weaponry around the world. There's a lot of chaos, a lot of they lose a lot of control, and their chance of their own self-annihilation increases quite a bit. Like so that's the least preferable scenario of the many scenarios that are at play right now. It doesn't mean they're not willing to do it, right? It just means that they'd rather not. They would rather that everybody just agree that China and Russia and Iran and other countries simply let go of their delusional belief that they can succeed in creating a new viable system. Go back 10 years into the past. Everybody just get back on the Titanic, get back in the cage, and just agree to a slow, peaceful kill, right? A culling of the herd in a more clean way, right? With more drugs, psychedelics, metaverses for everybody, as we don't pay attention to the destruction of our food supply. That's a more preferable approach. The fact that these Eurasian powers don't seem to be at all willing to go back in time and to do this increases the reality of things getting hotter and hotter. I think it's for that reason that, I mean, China's dealing with an opponent that has control of thousands of nuclear weapons surrounding them. Even in the Pacific, there's there's nuclear submarines holding Trident missiles, each one with a kill factor of thousands and thousands of times more than anything we saw with Hiroshima or Nagasaki.
And not only conventionally, by the way, Nancy. I mean, they're especially Russia and China and even maybe Iran. I'm not sure. This is what I was gonna just go into just short for a few minutes. Like, they're technologically advanced. I mean, not only conventional weapons, but I mean, when you think of hypersonic or EMPs or I don't know whatever, or even defensive technologies, would you say they're much more advanced? And this is why the U.S. or whatever Anglo-American military industrial complex knows that. Would that be a truth? I mean,
well, Russia has exhibited technologies since 2018 of, like you said, there's hypersonic missiles that can go far faster than the speed of light and yet still bear a nuclear warhead. You have a variety of underground drones that can carry nuclear warheads that Russia has unveiled. China has recently done a test of a hypersonic missile that went around the Earth and missed their target but by not a large margin, which is far beyond anything that we've seen from the capacities of the same technologies from the U.S. military-industrial complex. So I think that at the very least, this is exhibited. It has destroyed the game theory models that the West is following that have convinced through, again, always mathematical probability thinking. That's what these game theory models are based upon, just like Darwinism, just like our current, basket case economy. It's all probability mathematics. It's unreal, but they've persuaded leading idiotic NATO-file generals that a nuclear war is winnable under certain systems of probability, under certain conditions where the U.S. takes out the response capabilities of Russia and China. That has been what they've been operating on for over 20 years under full spectrum dominance. The full spectrum encirclement of Russia and China containment. So these new technologies, I think, have disproven those theories and have demonstrated that no, you could launch an attack, but at the same time, with these new hypersonics and other things, we can certainly do more damage to you, or at least take you out as well. So that throws a lot of those theories out of the window. Now, is there tech that I don't know about? Sure, maybe. Undoubtedly, there's classified.
That's definitely. I mean, just because it's not publicly accessible, this is one of my favorite topics. But I mean, it's a whole wormhole.
It's a wormhole, yeah. I mean, but there's electromagnetic weaponry. There's other things,
plasma technology or magnetic gravitational.
On both sides, right? That have been working on it. Yeah. So there's that factor too. So I mean, I'm limited to what I can say.
Yeah, we don't have the evidence, but I mean, we know for a fact, if you listen to Cat and Austin Fitz or others, inside whistleblowers or experts, I mean, where did all the tens and tens of, I don't know how many trillions of dollars or fiat money, being poured into these compartmentalized, non-disclosed technologies?
Oh yeah, so there's that factor in the whole thing, and that's why it's very important just to go back to the original question, like what is it that these countries are committed primarily to survival and non-depopulation, non-global government. Like the unipolar idea is based on the idea that there will be one pole, one center of command that controls the entire system, right? One executive branch that controls everything under a system which is simply the whole, the sum is the whole of its parts in a system of diminishing returns forever, until some asteroid comes that destroys us, and then it's all a big joke. So that's the one paradigm and just watch Netflix sci-fi movies that you're being conditioned to to watch, and you'll get a sense of the type of nihilistic thinking that they want our entire society to embrace as part of this go nowhere new existence. The other view is based upon an idea of a mutual respect for the sovereignty of various countries that can have a deliberation process and not imposing your values onto the system as a whole. That's much more healthy. And I think it's much more in communion with what I said earlier about my view of what an overall down the line, mature, healthy society will be, has to pass through certain stages organically before we can get to the Gene Roddenberry, Star Trek ideal, which is, I believe that's sort of more in alignment with what I think human beings are capable and destined to do as a creature of
definitely
discovery, right?
Out of time. Yeah.
So, but again, you can't skip steps. And I think part of the not skipping of steps is moving through a multipolar system first, learning how to do that properly. And as we learn how to do that properly, then we can then take the next step of mastery of ourselves and our society by going forward. Now, part of that involves not blowing up the world and undoing the experiment. So I think, again, like China and Russia have been trying to avoid blowing up the world and are they're like doing a dance with the devil in a sense.
Yeah.
And that involves kind of using your enemy's momentum as much as you can against it. And if there's a momentum with the lie, the narrative of man-made global warming, it's almost become a new secular religion. You can't just tell a foreign people that their entire religious order is a fraud. That will be a great way to drive them into hysterics, including the leadership class as well as the masses. So they're playing, I think, a certain game right now of, if you can't just say it's a lie, to at least try to control how the response to globalization is going to unfold. Will it be done the way the depopulation freaks want it to be done, of destroying industrial technology, shutting down hydrocarbons, dumbing down the people, and making them all nature worshipping idiots? Or is it going to be with the increased utilization of hydrocarbons, which, yes, that's what China and Russia and India are all doing. They're putting some excess money into investing in windmills and solar panels, largely that are generating energy for their residential buildings. They're not utilizing that energy for their industries.
It's unviable on a scale. I mean,
yeah, it's like, it's a little bit of a loss that they're taking, but overall they're using it in a smart way, because yes, you can have residential energy based on solar panels, but you can't sustain industrial capital energy systems,
especially not for 8 billion people, and exponentially increasing.
Yeah, exactly. So that's what we're being told to do with our Green New Deal and Build Back Better. Whereas they're using it in an appropriate way, but they're going for nuclear power, they're going for fusion power, they're going for every form of hydrocarbon you could imagine, and they're helping other countries develop their hydrocarbon needs in Africa and other things. Because it's like, tell an African society living in starvation and no industrialization that they have to just have windmills and solar panels. Yeah, good luck. When and they're not allowed to use the coal or oil under their soil. They're not allowed. No, China's not stopping them. They're helping them. So all of that indicates to me that they're controlling the terms and conditions of how climate change and how sustainability are being defined. Russia is too. So is India. And on the other hand, for I don't know if I might put this on YouTube later, maybe, so I won't say the word, but under COBIB, uh, COBIB response. They've also ensured that certain things like, hydroxychloroquine is massivly widely available as a response protocol, as it has been since the very start of this thing. Right. They're also very much aware of bio labs that have been deploying all sorts of bio agents on cattle, livestock, humans in China, which has been going on since SARS 2003. Mm-hmm. Same thing for Russia, has been experiencing various forms of bio warfare for a period. I think by virtue of me having said that, this can't go on YouTube anyway. So they have many variables to keep into consideration. Namely, the key thing is stability, and number two is survival, and not allowing Pfizer to come in with their mRNAs. India has done the same thing. Their Supreme Court just ruled that no governor of any province of India is allowed to force mandates, vax mandates.
It seems India has a really still a functional justice system, because I mean, in Austria and Germany, it's all corrupted. I mean, you've been on the Corona Investigative Committee, with Ryan Filmich, and he always said he has hopes for Austria, but now I've lost all hopes. And I studied law, and I see the process. The constitutional court is totally biased and maybe even corrupted or extorted or whatever. But in Germany, it's gone. I mean, the justice system is gone. From the very very small courts up to the constitutional courts, it's all super corrupted.
I've been very disenchanted. I have seen there's some courts that have exhibited a bit of a fight.
Yeah, I don't want to individual judges who have been, by the way, then prosecuted, and even the people. I mean, it's mind-boggling what they're doing to the people.
Yeah, and I mean, there's still a very important role to play for the court system in the current fight, but it can't just be that. Like, if people are putting their eggs in that basket, they're setting themselves for some serious disappointment. Yeah. You need to have a fuller spectrum approach to this. Mm-hmm. I don't have all of the answers, but I do know what's lacking, and I do know what type of attributes are necessary. Again, read my books if you want to get a sense of some of those attributes and some of the battle plan. But certainly the Asian court system, especially India, has demonstrated a good quality of fight. In Pakistan, there's a big fight. We saw that there was pressure to bend to the demands of the U.S. State Department to oust Imran Khan, who was a little bit too pro-Russia, China. The current government, though, despite that, is still not that bad. They didn't get like a George Soros government in there. They just got something that is a little bit less rebellious than Imran Khan was being. But they're still on board with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Belt and Road, working with Russia. So it's even that's not such a big defeat. Philippines as well, right? We've seen Philippines demonstrate that despite having Smartmatic, Soros, Mark Malloch Brown's vote rigging operations, despite that, the Soros, Mark Malloch Brown styled operative who was supposed to win did not succeed in the fraudulent, which should have been yet another fraudulent election. And in fact, despite that, the population turned out in such force, and there was such a coordinated effort by even the elites, the patriotic elites within Philippines, that Ferdinand Marcos's son, Junior, succeeded, and has succeeded in a very important way. So there's a variety of wins that people have to hold in mind. The current fight in the USA is still a big one. That's a big point of battle even now, despite the fact that that there was a coup not that long ago. But there are good-hearted, good-minded Republicans currently who are not neocons, who are trying their best, and I think could still find some interesting wins coming into the new elections now unfolding this year. So you have to have a multi-parameter fight, but you can't do it without a recognition that Eurasia is doing the battle. Like, the biggest battle that's happening right now is Eurasia on so many levels. And if we try to do our little local thing without harmonizing our strategy with what's actually going on, we're wasting a lot of energy and a lot of time. And we might even find ourselves thinking that Russia or China are the bad guys, and missing the real agencies of evil, which is what a lot of people who are
but you know, no wonder. I mean, the depth and the degree of propaganda, censorship, manipulation, and brainwashing and mass formation, to use the word of Professor Desmond. I got to read the book still, but I'm trying to get him on a show. I mean, he's already said yes, but I need to find an appointment with him. Let me just wrap up with two. I just don't want to take too much time with you, Matthew. But maybe two final questions, since I mean this is a Bitcoin podcast focused on Bitcoin, but the more
let's do one last question, because I have an interview very soon,
sure.
So let's do.
How much time do you have? Do you have a few minutes?
Let's do. I can do 10 more minutes.
Okay. Do you want to talk about the fiat system, the gradual and sudden maybe crash of the fiat system, or Iran enriching their uraniums? You know, after so many years of negotiation, they had this nuclear deal, and then they just tore it apart and just trashed it. Which topic would you want to just wrap it up with?
Okay, let's return back to value to wrap it up. So the question of fiat versus non-fiat. I think that what was said by Siluanov, the finance minister of Russia last week, was very funny and very true, where he was responding to the U.S. Under U.S. sanctions, there has been a prohibition of Russia to pay their balance of payments and their debt obligations, which is another aspect of the economic war against Russia, to try to destroy the Russian ruble, which, despite all of their attempts at sanctioning and other things, the Russian ruble has recovered almost all of the losses. I think all of the losses have been recovered that had begun in February of this year, because like Russia, China, India, other markets in Eurasia are very happy to absorb the losses. Yeah. And those committing the sanction regimes are doing greater damage to themselves and to their own people, as we see right now with people who are being told to freeze to death this coming winter to save Ukrainians, and pay like $8 at the gas pump per gallon. I mean, for what? Why? People are already starving. They're not working anymore because of 2 years of COVID, and now you're telling them to suffer even more. They don't have a lot more to give. So most people don't really care so much about the geopolitical narratives. They need to feed their family. They need to have a job. They need to have, affordable energy, and they're not being given that. They're being told to instead die for the New World Order in the West. So Russia currently, going back to Siluanov. So he responded when he was asked by somebody, a journalist, well, what is your response to this crisis of Russia not being able to pay their debts because of the sanctions? And he said, look, the US dollar, the euro, it's candy wrappers. It has no value backing it. It's candy wrappers. And we're being told to exchange oil, commodities, real reality-backed money in exchange for candy wrappers. It's a fraud. It's not a big loss. And he basically said, don't worry about it. You're freaking out too much. It's not that big of a threat as you think it is. It's not real money. And it's true. Like we've lost the money in circulation under the US dollar, has completely lost any viability.
And trust,
especially
after being, frozen. I mean, they started, freezing all kinds of accounts.
Whatever. Oh yeah, they froze Venezuela, they froze Iran, they froze Afghanistan.
If the trust is gone, what's left?
Exactly. The whole basis of the system is that you have some faith that these pieces of paper that we allow to circulate have some value. If people don't have the faith, then you go the way of Weimar Germany, 1923, right, where people soon realized, wait a minute, there's more money than there are atoms in the sun. Maybe the money doesn't have value, and people were wiping their butts with, $1 million Reichsmarks. Now, the solution to that would have been here. So this is where history is useful, right? The solution to the Weimar Germany 1923 would have been the 1922 Rapallo Accords that were organized in Italy between the Russians and the Germans, especially around Walter Rathenau and Kurt von Schleicher, his assistant, who had organized a abolition of the Versailles Treaty debt repayments, basically a debt jubilee.
Weren't they part of the Bank of International Settlements, the Central Bank of Central Banks?
That came later. That was set up in 1930 under the Young Plan. Mm-hmm. That was a J.P. Morgan operation with the Bank of England. But that was 8 years later. But in 1922, the the German patriots were followers of Abraham Lincoln and Frederick List around the figure of Kurt von Schleicher, who later became chancellor. He was assassinated by Hitler, and his boss, who was Walter Rathenau. They were leaders of the Frederick List Society, the Frederick List movement, which was again modeled on the U.S. Hamiltonian Lincoln system of protectionism, long-term state credit, internal improvements. So the idea of that list system that they were promoting with the Russians, the better Russians, because you had good and bad Russians fighting for control at the time, right? The Bolshevik Revolution had just happened, and it was a mixed bag. But what they had negotiated successfully was, one, an abolition of the unpayable debts, so you don't have to print money to pay unpayable debts. Number two, a mutual infrastructure investment program with Russia and Germany both mutually cooperating on helping the other industrially develop through investments into R&D, the advanced sector infrastructure, and that would have created it would have increased the purchasing power of the Reichsmarks, of the rubles in circulation, because you're increasing the real world value, right? That's how to increase the purchasing power of paper. The reason why people have faith in the paper is because they can see that the real world that they live in is generating real creative wealth, and their lives are improving. And so I have faith that this paper has value, and and I could buy more with less paper over time, which is why even though people were, earning quantitatively less in the 1970s, when we still had an industrially productive, powerful society compared to today, that lower income per cap, like nominally, like quantitatively, was still able to support, with one man working an average job as a blue collar worker, was still able to support a family of 3, 4, 5 kids, one paycheck, with like vacation money, with a car, having a house,
because
like things that today are
right, with goods and services produced. I mean, right?
Yeah, you were producing something real, and today that's unimaginable. You can't have that. You have to have at least 2 parents working at least two jobs, sometimes 3 or 4.
Yeah. And on top
to
of
get
that, you have now the unimaginable, central bank's balance sheet,
yeah.
of just printing whatever digitally.
Yeah, it's monopoly money. It's candy wrappers today. Whereas, so Russia and China increasingly have their values of the money in circulation, whether digital or whether physical, whatever. It's premised around real commodities,
right?
Oil, wheat, industrial goods production. There's real indices of value. So you could say kind of it has a quality of fiat, but it's not really, like, because you can produce credit within the central banking system of China, but the credit is behaving in a way which, one, has some association with the real world that is real. Number two, is investing itself, is tied to the real economy. So like 90% of the new currency in circulation in China, as Sergei Glaziev pointed out beautifully, goes towards the real economy. It increases the overall free energy of the system. Whereas in the same new currencies created in the Western system, something like $1 out of $5 has any connection, even a little bit, to the real economy. Most of it just goes back into inflating the bubble. So it's totally devoid of reality. It's hyperinflationary. So one type of debt is anti-inflationary because the purchasing power of the credit in circulation increases, and the other type, it is very inflationary because you're just creating more money, but you're creating no real value. Exactly. So candy wrapper. And that's where I would say, on a principled level, I'm not going to get into the details of crypto and other things. I'm not going to do that. But I'm just saying a Bitcoin. Sorry. Sorry. Yeah. But the most important thing for anybody to have in mind, I think, on a principled level of the science of value and science economy, is that whatever type of mechanism that people put online, as far as the type of currency, digital, Bitcoin, other, it has to be obedient to that reality. To the degree that they are not aware of that, it will blow up in their face. So we have to have those real scientific metrics.
Yeah, and that's why we need Bitcoin, Matthew, because it's incorruptible. There's only 21 million, and it's all the properties of Bitcoin. It's uncensorable, unconfiscatable. It's truly distributed and decentralized. So this is it's only math, and there's just no rulers, just rules. And I think this is the time has come. We need something that is just neutral, math, code, and incorruptible.
Well, look, for me, I'm a fan of being aware of our strengths and weaknesses, and I tend to avoid using the absolute language of incorruptible. For me, that's an absolute word, because I think everything created by man is corruptible in a sense, because we are corruptible.
It's distributed and it's decentralized.
Look, we're creatures of wisdom and folly. So to the degree that we allow foolish, wrong ideas to govern our society, anything we create can be used foolishly to the detriment of our children. Anytime we have wisdom as good ideas governing our society, any tool we create will be used for the good in various degrees. And so I would put Bitcoin in that mix of created tools as I would a hammer or any other good thing that could also be governed by folly. Because I think that if we are too, arrogance always kills us. And lack of humility always gets us to misstep.
Yeah, definitely. No, I'm totally with you. Yeah, we always need to be conscious and aware of our, preserving our humility.
I can come up with scenarios where somebody goes and does something super dumb, and within that system, the Bitcoin in circulation could be falsely divided up, maybe infinitely, to the point that it's so diffused and not attached to real production. That could happen.
But the thing is about it's the use case. The proof is in the pudding. I mean, people are using it when we talk about whatever, not like Western countries, but countries where it's inflationary, hyperinflationary, where people are being incarcerated because they're going to the street. I mean, especially more and more truckers. All these people, they're coming out and saying, if it wasn't for Bitcoin.
I know, and Bitcoin has helped me quite a bit too. Don't get me wrong.
They're using it. People are using it. Store of value, mutual exchange.
I hear you. I have a wallet. I have a wallet. I encourage it. It's helped me out too. Don't get me wrong. I'm just saying, going into battle, it's important to be aware of weaknesses and strengths. And infinite has two directions. There's infinite of more and infinite divisible. So it's like the Zeno's paradox. Technically by Zeno's paradox, you should be able to go from here to here, because you're always going by halves forever. And thus, in that mathematical logic, you should never be able to get from point A to point B, because there's infinite halvings, as well as you could always add infinitely from the outside. So the fact that, there's a limited amount of Bitcoin available, you could always have, in our current fiat system, you could always infinitely have more money. That's bad. But I think that the inversion of that infinite expression in subdivisions is also can walk you into an inflationary chamber if you're not doing it well. The infinite is a bad infinite in either direction could cause you to see something bad happen as far as inflation is concerned, if you're not aware of the physical boundary conditions of the real world that we live in, with the 8 billion people in a physical world, in a universe that's creative. If you don't have those real parameters first and foremost in your mind, you could misstep along the way.
Yeah, but because you talked a lot about purchasing power, and that's what I'm saying. Once we have this deflationary money, and that is Bitcoin, then you need less and less for more and more and better, products and services and technology. So I think this is a very topic very dear to my heart. That's but it needs a really I think a special session maybe in the future, which I would love to to catch up with you soon, hopefully.
Okay, all right, man. Oh, it's always a pleasure. I really enjoy
talking to you, man. Let me know where people can find you. I mean, besides that Volume 3 book, which I'm gonna put explicitly as a link, but where else on LinkedIn, Twitter, website?
Well, I'm trying to grow my Telegram channel, so if people want to try it's t.me / Canadian Patriot Press.
Yeah.
That's always being updated. And the other thing is CanadianPatriot.org is my main website. Also, with my wife, we co-manage the Rising Tide Foundation.net is another more cultural website that people can check out. And if they want to participate in the weekly lectures and workshops that we host, usually twice a week, they could send us an email at info@risingtidefoundation.net. If they want also a free copy of the book, I know some people can't afford to pay for the book. It's preferable that you buy it, but if you can't, don't worry about it. The economy kicked a lot of people's butts. I understand.
It's worth it.
Yeah, you can send us an email at the info@risingtidefoundation.net. Send you a free copy of the PDF. And yeah, I think that'll keep you busy for a while. Yeah.
I guess so. So hey man, good luck with your next interview, and hopefully, yeah, let's stay in touch.
Yeah, man.
Okay.
All right. Ciao.
Bye.
Bye.
All right. I just want to, in closing, I want to say, Matthew. I love, I love the knowledge comprehension and the wisdom of Matthew Arrett. When it comes to money and Bitcoin and economics and Austrian economics, maybe Matthew has a little bit different approach and different thought patterns, but I think it deserves a special session, a special séance, what do we call it, a special discussion with Matthew, maybe some other more or less prominent Bitcoiner who is really deep into that. I would love to have like a deep talk with a Canadian, with another Canadian, Jeff Booth, one of my favorite Bitcoiners and authors. The Price of Tomorrow: Why Deflation is the Key to an Abundant Future. But check out Matthew Arrett on Twitter, LinkedIn, on his website. I'm going to put all the links in the show notes. And Bitcoin fixes this. Accumulate as much as possible. Get yourself a hardware wallet. Get yourself a mobile wallet. Start with something. If you're on exchange, which you should not in the long term, just get it off the exchange and transfer it to a hardware wallet, and be an individual sovereign, and be in control of your own destiny, of your own money, and of your own future for yourself and for your children. All right, that's about it. Thank you so much. I'm the host of the Keyvan Davani Connection Show, and I'll see you soon. Thank you so much. Bye.